If you believe the polls, and there's no reason to doubt them, Pierre Poilievre is set to be the next Prime Minister of Canada. The Conservative leader and his party have been leading in every poll taken for the last year. In fact, the last time the Liberals were out in front in a poll was May 29th, 2003, in a release by Leger for Post Media. Since then, it's only been up and up and up for Poilievre and the Conservatives. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host. And today we're going to talk about Pierre Poilievre and a new book that's called Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life by Andrew Lawton. Andrew is a longtime political commentator who's worked in radio, print, digital media. He's currently editor-in-chief of True North and host of the Andrew Lawton Show there. Andrew, welcome, my friend.
Hey, good to be with you, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
It's a fun read. It's an interesting one, and it's one that is telling me new things about a guy that I've known for 20 years now, because he was elected 20 years ago. I met him on that first campaign. But you talked to an amazing number of people. You surprised me with not only how many people you tracked down to speak about Pierre, but who and why. You spoke to journalists who interviewed him as a student, old school acquaintances, political friends and foes. How many people did you actually talk to try and get a sense of who Pierre Poilievre is and why that matters for us as we enter this next political phase?
So someone else asked me this in another interview, and I had in my mind 60, and I said that, and then I went back and looked because I had a tracking document, and it was actually closer to 80 if I include conversations that I had that I didn't have an audio recording of, that were just on background or that I took some notes on. But it was pretty much pushing 80 people, and some of those were, of course, 15 minutes. They tell you the one story they have with Pierre. Others were hours and hours long, so it was actually quite a voluminous amount of information to sift through afterwards.
Well, what jumps out at me is a couple of things in the book jump out at me that are important themes and consistent themes that you see in Poilievre, in his past, in his actions, that I think inform who he is today. And I'm talking about things like using unconventional campaign methods to win the nomination for that first election 20 years ago, or that he was writing about freedom while he was still a student. So, before we get into any, concrete examples or stories, what did that sort of draw for you? What does it tell you about who Poilievre is now and how he might campaign or govern if he does win?
So I think there has always been in conservative politics in Canada, especially recently, this concern about leaders that cater or pander to the base, and then once they win the leadership, they all of a sudden decide to cater or pander, depending on your perspective on this, to the center. And that pivot has been very abrupt and not particularly suave for people like Aaron O'Toole, notably. And so I think with Pierre Poilievre, it is interesting to see that, in the last couple of years, he's been consistent. The stuff he talked about in the leadership race is the stuff he talks about now that he's leader. But that's not all that surprising if you go back 20 years, 25 years, and find that he was talking about the same stuff then. And that was really, I think, a standout thing in the book. There's something that stood out to me was just how little he's changed in some key philosophical ways over his journey.
He was one of the finalists for Magna's If I Were Prime Minister contest. I think it started in the late 90s, ran through the early 2000s. I'm not sure when it wrapped up, but I don't think it's going anymore. And it was in 2000 that he was one of the top 10, and he was writing all about freedom. That was the entire point, is that ultimate freedom leads to better societies, right?
Yeah, he was. And it was interesting. A lot of that, it was the 2,500 word essay. He basically pulled an all-nighter to do it and get it in the mail to submit it. So it wasn't even something he really, by his admission many years ago, took that much time with. But with the exception of a few little individual things that maybe didn't stand the test of time, like the one that everyone likes pointing out is him saying that MPs should have a 2-term limit. That one, obviously.
And He would resign after 2 terms.
Yeah, he would resign after 2 terms. That was one. And some of these populist reform policies like voter recall, that hasn't really withstood the test of time for him anyway. But generally speaking, if you look at a lot of the core overarching messaging, even some of the language and turns of phrases, I found parallels between that essay and his video announcing his leadership race in 2022.
I mean, that video announcing his leadership was very unconventional. It was controversial to the Ottawa Press Gallery anyway. It was mocked heartily by a lot of the people that think they know how politics works and should work, especially him saying, I'm running to be Prime Minister of Canada. You know, how dare you say that? Well, that's kind of how a lot of Canadians think. You and I may know that's not how our system operates, but reality and perception aren't always the same thing. And people think, oh, who do I want for prime minister? Well, you know, none of us vote for who we want to be prime minister. But that was an unconventional thing. But there's another story that you tell when he was in his first nomination. And, you know, I was living in Ottawa at the time. I was a local reporter. I didn't cover the nomination. I just covered him after he was trying to take on David Pratt. But I'm looking back at the names that he took on to win the nomination and went, oh, wow, he took on some heavy hitters in local Ottawa conservative circles and he won. But he, just like with the video being unconventional, he used unconventional tactics then. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I just to set the stage here for people, because this is just, you know, ancient history in some contexts. The Reform or the Alliance and PC parties had just merged, and it was the end of 2003. So all of a sudden, even though people had been gearing up for a 2004 election, there were nominated Alliance candidates and nominated PC candidates. I don't know if there was a nominated PC candidate in his riding, but there was an Alliance candidate. So when the parties merged, that Alliance candidate assumed, okay, well, I'll just run for the Conservative Party of Canada nomination and I'll win that. And then you also had a city councillor in Ottawa saying, well, I want to get in there as well. You had a member of the Lebanese community in Ottawa, a teacher, very well connected, that wanted to get in it as well. Because everyone realized that this was one of these ridings that with a merged Conservative vote would likely be, or almost certainly be, a Conservative win. And Pierre Poilievre, this 24-year-old political staffer for Stockwell Day, who had basically just moved to the riding to run there, was like, yeah, no, I want to do this as well. So he actually did stuff that right now is part of the standard candidate toolkit for nominations, but at the time wasn't. And one of them was going door knocking. He actually did canvassing, but during a nomination race, going to the doors of people he knew were Conservative members, and also going to the doors of people he thought were likely to be Conservative members or supporters just by virtue of where they were in the riding. And he sold his memberships and had a pretty solid contingent of members that had joined to vote for him when it got to that nomination meeting.
But going to doors in a nomination race, you quote John Baird in the book, unheard of.
Yeah.
And John Baird was a political veteran at that point. He was still down at Queen's Park. He hadn't yet moved to the federal scene, but he'd been an elected guy for more than 10 years. He knew that whole area intimately, had been involved in politics for years before he was elected. So, I mean, that was something that you just wouldn't see every day. But, you know, I think that and before I go on, he beat David Pratt once he got the nomination. David Pratt was a well-respected, considered blue liberal, well-liked in Ottawa. He was Paul Martin's defense minister, and Poilievre beat him. So the two things I take from that story are that people often underestimate Pierre. And secondly, he's willing to try and do things that others won't. And I think that's what he's doing with these rallies, with this, with, you know, approaching how you discuss topics with the public, how you treat the media. He's breaking the playbook wide open and saying, I'm doing it a different way.
Yeah, and I should point out that the idea of going door to door was claimed by Michael Cooper, who's a conservative member of parliament. Now, he's about 5 years younger than Pierre Poilievre, but the two were friends. And he told me in an interview that he gave Pierre that idea when they were having dinner over the winter break at Caesars, a steakhouse in Calgary. So that was Michael Cooper's contribution to he had many contributions to the book, but to Pierre Poilievre's political story there. But absolutely, and I think we see now, too, him circumventing the parliamentary press gallery, which has become a very deliberate tool that he's used. And to your point, Brian, very unconventional, especially among conservative politics, but among politics in general.
Yeah, Stephen Harper tried and was somewhat successful in circumventing the press gallery in his early days, but we had a different media landscape then. He would go and he would speak to the local journalists in Brockville or London, Ontario, or Red Deer, and he would sometimes talk to the gallery, and it would infuriate people. But it worked. We don't have the same level of local journalism, especially political journalism, now that we did 20 years ago. So Pierre's finding different ways, and now you're seeing Justin Trudeau mimic that. Have you noticed all the times he's been talking to bloggers and vloggers lately, and people with podcasts, and very different interview settings for him than what he normally does?
Yeah, I mean, I take a bit more of a cynical view with Justin Trudeau, because I think Justin Trudeau is also reaching the realization, or has reached the realization, that he's no longer getting the ride from the parliamentary press gallery that he was, I think, a few years ago. And I think when he goes to these podcasts, a lot of the times these aren't A-list podcasts. These are smaller ones that people learn about because he's given them an audience. And I think he's going there because he's getting a bit of an easier ride. And I think the format itself is working for him a bit better, because now, if you've seen press conferences with Justin Trudeau, the Ottawa journalists are downright feisty with him in a way that they haven't been for throughout much of his term.
Absolutely. I think, Pierre knows he can't just talk to the Ottawa gallery, because he knows that conservatives generally don't get the same fair break that liberals do. So he's known that from the start, and Trudeau's having to do it now because, well, people are onto him and figured out that the country's kind of grumpy right now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing, too, that's interesting is that Pierre Poilievre, and I don't know if Stephen Harper did this as much. You would know better than I. He's made a point of really speaking to a lot of the ethnic media outlets. And because a lot of these communities across Canada have these ethnic newspapers that have circulation that just dwarfs the legacy media paper of record in the city. And whenever he gets criticized for this, you'll always see there's this little sort of veiled accusation of racism. Oh, are you saying these papers aren't real? Are you saying these journalists aren't real? And I've seen that online anyway. When anyone tries to say that he's not talking to the media, he points, well, look, I've spoken to all of these people.
Well, so on that, I've seen the criticism you're talking about. Suddenly, speaking of Red FM, which Trudeau does, by the way, at multi-ethnic radio station with, I don't know how many outlets they have across the country, but there's one in Mississauga. I know there's one in Vancouver. They've got a few.
I've been on the one in Calgary, and the audience
I was going to say, I think
massive.
Calgary has one. And you're right. So there are some people saying, well, these aren't real media outlets. Why are you talking to them? But Trudeau's been on them. But I also hear from the still devoted Max Bernier PPC crowd, and sometimes Max is the one pushing this, and you'll see him post on social media, that he shouldn't be talking to these ethnic media types, or he shouldn't be going to a Gurdwara, that he is pandering, doing ethnic politics pandering, and he's just like the liberals. How do the conservatives deal with that? How does or should Poilievre deal with that sort of thing?
So I think there are two strategies here, and one of the things that Jason Kenney did famously well was go to these ethnic communities across the country. He was immigration minister, just for context.
And he earned the nickname Minister of Curry in a Hurry. That's what the Indian community labeled him.
Yeah. And he would go in there and he would make a pitch. He would sell the same message that the conservatives were selling everywhere else, but he would make sure it was heard. He'd go into these communities that might not be tapped into the sources that, a white suburban audience in Etobicoke is tapped into. And he did that very well. And there's another way of doing ethnic politics, though, which is pandering, which is where you're going into a group and you're making a very specific promise that you're never going to repeat anywhere else. And then you go to another group and you promise them something, you go somewhere else. And we've seen some politicians in recent years do that. And you're really just taking advantage of the fact that no one outside of that group is going to know what you promised them. Pierre Poilievre hasn't done that. He has done something that, from what I've seen, is far more similar to the Jason Kenney, Stephen Harper approach, where he's going in there and he's giving the same message to them. He's telling them how it applies to them. This is how the message of freedom works for you guys. This is how my approach to this issue works for you. But he's doing that in a way that does not set him up for this weird laundry list of promises that people would look at and be like, "What? Why? Where did that come from?" I haven't seen that.
The video of him speaking at a Montreal synagogue where he said, "I give this same message in mosques across the country." That was a remarkable video and an openly frank one. And if that's the way he's doing it, great. I have unfortunately seen politicians of all stripes do that pandering, or not as much anymore. But once upon a time, you would regularly get politicians saying one thing in English, one thing in French, and assuming no one can speak both languages except them. Rather bizarre thing. But, so I hope it's not the pandering going on there. Max was really upset that Poilievre had gone and said, we'll get a direct flight to, what's the city in India?
Amritsar.
Yeah. And I thought, well, what's the problem with that? I was speaking to a British foreign service worker who's lobbying for more direct flights to Britain. People want direct flights. It is economic opportunity. And
if I can jump in on that. So when I first heard that promise, I was thinking, is this that pandering type of thing? And then I looked into it, and I actually learned that the reason there aren't that is because of ridiculous government regulation. It's not to do with airlines not wanting to. It's because there was this agreement with Canada and India about the number of flights and the number of airports. So it actually is, I think, a fairly free market position that he's taking. He's saying, listen, by offering these direct flights, we're going to get rid of, to use his language, a government gatekeeping that's taking place. But because that was the one, when I first heard it, I thought, okay, is this just some weird pandering thing? And then I looked into it and realized, oh no, this is actually like government nonsense that has made it so that this flight, where there is a huge market for it, can't happen.
I'd like to get your take on his handling of the media. And you talk about the incident with Urquhart from out in the Okanagan. That's on the back cover of the book. How do you like them apples? But this idea that he is hostile to the media, I've been on the receiving end as a journalist over my career of stare downs and aggressive pushback from politicians of all stripes. If you ask a question that gets under their skin, you're going to get a response. There seems to be this idea that it's only Pierre Poilievre doing that. Justin Trudeau would never do that. He's done it to me, but he wouldn't do it to the real journalists or the real media in the gallery. What is your sense of how he deals with the media as someone who is in media?
So Andrew Scheer gave a very illuminating quote, which I haven't memorized, so I'm paraphrasing here in the book, in which he says that, we should basically not treat media who are hostile to us any differently than we treat the liberals who are hostile to us, which is that if they're making a political point, we should respond the exact same way. We shouldn't just have them as the sacred cow, effectively. And that's my term, not his. And I think he's speaking to, I suspect, Pierre Poilievre's mindset in this way, of that journalists are fair game. If journalists who have a tremendous amount of power to set a narrative and craft a narrative are going to come in and ask a loaded question or something he feels is a loaded question, he has a right to respond and challenge the premise. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And look, I have a lot of people in the press gallery that I get along quite well with. I spoke to a number for the book. I also think there are some in the press gallery who are very much partisans in a lot of the work that they do and a lot of the way they approach these issues. And
which is fine in the general sense. You and I approach our work in media and journalism from a particular viewpoint, but we're commentators. We're not pretending to be neutral.
No, and also, if I were to go to a Justin Trudeau press conference and not be risking arrest in doing so, I were to ask some really go in hot and ask some question, I would totally be fine with him responding and saying, well, actually, that's nonsense, and here's why. And that's, I think, his right. So it was interesting. I did speak to one journalist who said they feel Poilievre's approach, and this was not a conservative journalist, it was a legacy media journalist in the press gallery. They said Poilievre's approach actually forces them to be better. This person thinks they're saying basically, journalists need to make sure they're prepared and not go in there with a lazy, people say this question or some people think this, like go in with specifics.
Well, that one with the guy in the Okanagan, some people say it's right out of Trump's playbook.
Yeah.
Who says that? Well, some people.
You're taking a page. What page? Show me the page.
that was, I don't know the guy. I feel sorry for him that, you're being embarrassed across the country. And here we are still talking about it months later. But if you go in like that, you're going to get hammered. I remember early in my career being given a question written out by my editor to ask Lucien Bouchard. And it was over the top, and I'll admit now, looking back on it, ridiculous. I'm standing in the TVA studios. He's just finished an interview on TVA in downtown Montreal, and he comes over for a scrum, and cameras are rolling, and I asked this question, and he made me look like a fool because my question was foolish. So I don't have an issue with that. If he does it too often, I wonder if people will think he comes across as too mean. I think he's got to pick his moments, but that would be about all I'd have to say there.
Yeah, and which is why I talk about, and again, to mention someone you and I have both worked with, David Aiken, I talk about another episode where I think it was his first press conference or one of his first press conferences as leader on Parliament Hill. And David Aiken, was not really all that keen on not having a guarantee that Pierre Poilievre would be taking questions. And there's that moment where he's just being very belligerent, quite frankly, with, interrupting Pierre Poilievre during his prepared statement.
I think something like 7 times.
Yeah, and something like that is just gold for the Conservatives. Like they turned that into a fundraising letter almost immediately. And I know other journalists were rather embarrassed by the episode because it fed into the perception that Poilievre has tried to stoke about journalists. And I think that's the moment, is that he is primed right now where whenever he sees that opening to prove his point about the media, he's going to take it.
And Aiken, as you say, is somebody you and I have worked with over the years or alongside. He had an office next to me at Sun News Network for 5 years. That was a surprising moment. I was surprised to see that from him. But, it is what it is. I want to talk about people's perceptions of Pierre and what you find he's really like when we come back. We got to take a quick break, but I keep hearing he's a mean guy, and I think, who have you been talking to? More when we come back. There's an idea out there that Pierre Poilievre is a mean dude, that he's always angry. And he can definitely be someone that goes in elbows up, Andrew, but I'm wondering if it's just a perception people have because of stereotypes. You and I have both hosted talk radio shows. You and I both laugh a lot on air. But I would still have people who obviously never listen to me say, oh, he's just angry all the time. Oh, Brian Lilly, he's grumpy. I'm like, you obviously don't listen. I'm wondering, is that it with Pierre, or is there something in his public demeanor, his character, his psyche that makes people think this is an angry dude and that's turning me off? Because I had a conversation with a very politically astute person a little while ago who that was his view of Pierre. That this man, there's, always negative.
It's funny. I just saw not that long ago a clip where Pierre Poilievre was in the House of Commons and Justin Trudeau was talking about his housing plan, and he makes this comment about how he's putting a housing catalog in, and Pierre Poilievre just rolls off that immediately and starts talking about, and he basically gets the Conservatives to give Justin Trudeau a standing ovation. Because, oh, wow, look, he's making a catalog. Good for you. Like, he's having the time of his life when he does this. But you're right. People will look at that and mistake passion, which I think you need to have to be effective as a broadcaster, as a politician, whatever it is, mistaking that with anger. And I think he gets angry, I'm sure. And we've seen him be a bit more pointed at times. But he also, one-on-one, in all the conversations I've had about him with people that know him well, I've never heard anyone recount a story of anger. Now, I've heard people recount stories that were not pleasant encounters of, him being very demanding as an employer, of him saying things that people have taken as mean-spirited in a particular context. So it's not to say that he's just all sunshine and roses every day. But I've never heard of him being a temperamental person, and that was not something I got. But I think people forget that when you're the leader of the opposition, opposition is baked into your name. You are the antagonist to the government. That is your not constitutional, but it's your political role. And I could see how someone would mistake that for being a crank, for being cantankerous.
Yeah, he's a very affable guy, very thoughtful in my experiences with him, and a very determined, hardworking. We'll get into that when we talk about the leadership race. But did you get a sense? I know you talk about it briefly in the book. He was going to run in 2020 for the leadership of the Conservative Party, the one that Aaron O'Toole won. And I had spoken to him the night before about his launch the next morning. And I've never gotten a clear reason as to why he backed out. Did you?
Well, you sort of. I have a couple of, I don't want to say theories. Let me just take a step back here, because one of the challenges is that it seemed very abrupt for the reason you just mentioned, that people were talking to him that night, and then the next morning he's saying he's out. And people have made the conclusion from that, understandably so, that it was really this 11th hour decision. Now, the one part I did get definitively was that the doubts had started forming much earlier. But he knew that if he was going to do it, he had to behave and act a certain way. So he was operating as though he was going to do it while he was working out these doubts, because he knew that he couldn't afford to just sit there and do nothing. So he basically was erring on the side of, I'm doing this, but he wasn't fully in it. And then there was a moment that he did speak about publicly where that night, maybe after your conversation with him, maybe you're the reason, Brian, who knows? He says, all right, I'm going to go to bed. And I'm going to wake up, and basically the first thing that I think about this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to wake up, and that's how I feel. And then he realized this is not what I wanted. Now, one of the more compelling reasons I've ever heard about that's never been reported elsewhere is that at that time, Pierre and his wife Anna were just learning about the extent of their daughter Valentina's diagnosis of autism. She has had tremendous success through therapy over the years, but she's still nonverbal. It was something they were just grappling with at that moment. And I think that family dynamic of what this is going to mean for us was really sinking in at that point. So that's the most plausible explanation I've heard. There have always been, since that withdrawal, rumors circulating of some real reason, some sinister, ominous reason. There was some big manila envelope of opposition research. There was something that he wanted to hide or bury. There's never been any evidence towards that.
It's never been shared with me. People have hinted at that. It's like, okay, well, what do you have? Well, yeah, you should look into it. Well,
what do I look into? Just go around and say, hey, have you heard anything about? Yeah, but I think that he just didn't feel the timing was right, and maybe there was some higher power looking out for him in that moment, because it clearly wasn't right. I mean, I don't think the story would have at all materialized the way it did for him had he been the leader in 2021.
So Aaron O'Toole is fighting back against the Convoy and Convoy elements within his party. When he is struggling to save his leadership in February 2022. And I can't exactly say definitively that it was Pierre Poilievre that helped slip the knife in, but a lot of the people around him were part of the group that helped take out Aaron O'Toole. Did he know at that point that, all right, I'm in, we got to take care of the old leader first?
So, Pierre Poilievre's hand was not on the knife. And when I say that, I mean it. Now, the point that I make in the book is that his hands were so clean on the ousting of Aaron O'Toole that it is almost conspicuously so that everyone around him wanted to make sure that there was no connection whatsoever to him. So everyone around Pierre really saw that he was the natural next leader. He was the natural beneficiary, and they really went out of their way to keep him insulated from the movements against Aaron O'Toole. He did get a bit of a tip-off from one MP that, hey, get ready. And the understanding that I have about that conversation was that Pierre knew what it meant and probably did start getting ready in that moment, but was not involved. But he was basically told, hey, this is a thing that's going to happen, in not as many words.
Yeah, it's just, look, it's politics and it's how it works, but O'Toole was going to be gone no matter what. But the push, a lot of it did come from people who then gathered around Poilievre immediately.
Yeah, very much so. And to go back to that video you mentioned earlier, when he came out and was the first out of the gate, he was really trying to scare everyone else out of the race. And when he said Pierre for prime minister, he was basically saying the race is already over. I'm the leader. I'm running against Trudeau. I'm not worried about these, this Jean Charest guy, this, Ramon Bibar. No. I'm running for prime minister. I'm the guy. And that was really the message that he was trying to send. And I think largely it worked.
His work ethic is unbelievable. And I know you picked up on that from discussions. I think back, as I said, to that first campaign that he won in 2004, because I lived in the riding and was always going through it. I saw how hard he was working to win. And I remember telling Steve Madeley, the morning show host at CFRA back then, and well-connected politically, I said, Steve, this guy's going to beat David Pratt. Oh, no, not going to happen. And then he did. I said he's going to win this leadership if he's in it. He did. He works incredibly hard. I remember seeing him at one community event, and I said, how many have you been at today? And he said, this is the 8th. How many left? I think he had two or three more left to go in the day, 10 or more events during the day. That's probably slowed down since now that he's married and has 2 children, but that's the kind of work ethic he's bringing to try and win Canada for the Conservative Party.
Yes, and I would also point out that when the 2015 election came along, which was just an absolute blowout for the Conservatives, Poilievre was the only Conservative in the Ottawa area to keep his seat, and it was by, if I recall, I think about 2,000 votes. And largely, the only reason he survived that, many people have said, and I think you can sort of infer from the results, is because he had put in over the preceding 11 years all of that work, because he had built a name and a brand for Pierre Poilievre that was powerful enough to overcome the, at the time, toxicity of the Stephen Harper and Conservative brands.
You could call him on any given weekend to get a comment or just see what's going on. One of the things I like to do is I talk to politicians when I'm not interviewing them, and it's always just the same question. What are you hearing at the doors, or what are you doing? Didn't matter when you called him. There was a very good chance he was door knocking. Mm-hmm. That same thing he did to win the nomination. There would be an election on, but he'd say, Brian, if I'm not out door knocking, if I'm not out talking to people, then I'm disconnected from what they're thinking, and I'm not hearing from them. That's kind of the message that I know this isn't part of the book, but it's kind of the message he put out there with that fire your lobbyist op-ed he put out. You need to talk to the people.
Yeah, and he's been doing that. And I think what was interesting as well is that he also has in his riding of Carleton, he was originally in Nepean Carleton, a tremendous amount of public servants who are not typically a conservative demographic, people assume. But he really put in a lot of work to say to those people. Now, when I take aim at like Ottawa and government, I'm not talking about you guys. You're the real folks. You're my constituents. And he really tried to turn that into a political asset for him. And I think largely has been successful. You've
also written a book about the Freedom Convoy, and you talk about Pierre's overtures to the Freedom Convoy in this book. Is that something that's going to hurt him with swing voters? I'm not talking about the conservative base. The Liberals haven't been very good at making hay out of that, but does that potentially hurt him at some point with swing voters who weren't on side with the convoy?
Look, I think that there is a contingent of people who live in downtown Ottawa that will never forgive anyone that, was even marginally sympathetic to that, because it was very raw for them. I think for people everywhere else in the country, the sense that I've gotten is that they've moved on. The people that were not in the small group that was really on board or the small group that was really against have just moved on from it. And there's always the possibility that some externality in the news cycle changes. Like, let's say, for example, that a criminal conviction comes down for one of the people involved closer to the election. Like that could be the kind of thing that disrupts him and forces him to have to talk about it. But he was also always very cautious about it. He was very careful. He was never an out-and-out cheerleader. He was very measured and nuanced in his comments, and has also softened a little bit of it in interviews after the fact, I think, to try to insulate against that.
During the leadership, he would make appeals to people who might have been on board with the convoy, but it was more along the World Economic Forum stuff. And I remember writing a couple of columns critical of him for that, because my basic thinking was, look, World Economic Forum is real, but if you're appealing to people who believe that Klaus Schwab actually runs Canada, which is what I was hearing from people, why aren't you talking about this? I heard that Klaus Schwab actually runs Canada. If you're appealing to that, then you are getting into some wacky territory beyond, like, WEF is wacky and weird enough without making up stuff about it. Klaus Schwab does a very good job of making himself creepy. So I was critical of some of that. But he doesn't appear to be on that anymore. The Liberals aren't yelling at him about Bitcoin anymore, but that might be because it went back up.
Yeah, exactly. But let me just comment on the WEF stuff, because I've actually gone to Davos the last 3 annual meetings to cover the World Economic Forum. And I had a bit of criticism the first time from people that said something basically similar to what you said, which is that you're catering to people that believe in all these wacky conspiracy theories about the WEF. And I had sort of taken a view of it that I think has been, I've been proven correct on this, which is that makes it more important to address the issue in a very fact-based, measured way and say, no, this isn't the issue with the World Economic Forum, all this crazy stuff. This is, and point to the policies, point to the issues. And I think that he has done that in a lot of ways. He's talking about it, and he may immediately grab in the people that have conspiratorial views about the organization. But when the point that he makes, the point that he follows up with after he's got their attention is, hey, this is this agenda they have. Hey, this is this policy we're pushing. I think you're actually bringing people away from the fringes. Maybe that's an overly optimistic view, but I think that's what he could benefit from doing when he talks about that issue. And that's what I've tried to do when I cover the WEF.
I would agree with that, because it can be a powerful organization, but they don't run the government. They don't control Canada. Same with Agenda. What did they switch it to now? It used to be Agenda 2020, was it?
I think it was 21, and now it's 30 or 2030?
Agenda 21, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they invented a name that sounded like a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
I was...
Well, and Klaus Schwab doesn't do himself any favors when he talks about penetrating the cabinets. But
all of that. But it's important to pay attention to what they're doing, because those ideas do inform where our government wants to go on things. But that's the way that I always approached it. And I've been talking about them for, 15 years now. But you look at the ideas, they're crazy ideas. Make sure they're not implemented here. That's always been my view, much the way that you did in going there and reporting. Just a side note, just a very tiny town, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it is, and it's amazing that like everyone in the town leaves when the meeting is there because they can just make massive, massive money by shutting down your business to like rent it out to the government of India or whatever to have a little pavilion there. But yeah, it's very beautiful village. If I were seeking world domination, I would want to station somewhere there as well too. But
yeah, it's known for the World Economic Forum and the Spangler Cup, and more Canadians pay attention to the Spangler Cup, which is like a D-level hockey tournament. And but I still think we spend more time on that. Were you surprised after Poilievre won in September 2022 that the Liberals weren't ready with a bunch of attack ads to paint this guy as someone that suburban moms should never, ever go near?
It's a strange one, and I think normally that's what they do. That's their plan, to try to brand the guy before everyone else gets to brand him. I think the Liberals have a blind spot, though, and they have two blind spots. One of them is that they assume that everyone else sees Justin Trudeau the way they do, and the other is that everyone else sees Pierre Poilievre the way they do.
Which has been the Conservative problem for a while.
Yeah, and
they assumed everyone hated Justin Trudeau. Why don't they hate Justin Trudeau like we do?
Yeah.
I think was part of their problem.
Yeah, and I think that with Pierre Poilievre, they were so convinced that this is this far-right Canadian Trump, this radical terror of a candidate, that they assumed that it would spin itself, and that they hadn't quite realized that Canadians are not seeing him that way. Canadians are not. Some are, but many Canadians are not. And I think they assumed that their caricaturish perception of him was more widely held than certainly polling now, and the last 2 years has showed it is.
Corey Tonight was on the podcast a couple months back, and he said that failure by the Liberals to run attack ads defining Poilievre early on might be the biggest mistake in Canadian political history, because Pierre has gone on to define himself, and those rallies attract people who were not Conservative voters before, many who were voting for other parties or not at all, and they're on Team Pierre now.
They are, and again, I think that there was a time and place of this, and people have asked me, and I try to touch on it in the book. Was this a case of just a runaway freight train in Canadian politics that Pierre Poilievre happened to hop on and take to victory, or did he do this? Did he create this? And I think it's impossible to come to a conclusion that isn't both. Yes, there was a circumstance that benefited him. There was timing. There was a natural groundswell of people looking for change. But you needed someone very specific that could have harnessed that in the way that he did.
It's always a combination of hard work and luck coming together, and luck is often due to hard work. So I would say that. What do you see after all your writing about him, talking to people around him? What do you see as the future? What will he be like if he does get to govern? Is he going to do that pivot that you mentioned off the top? Is he going to be Donald Trump? What are your thoughts?
So it's funny. One of his friends, Adam Difala, who's a longtime conservative advocate, he had said in an interview that I did with him for my book that he expects a very ambitious first term, a very Mike Harris. I'm going to do everything I promised. I'm going to move quickly. I'm going to make some pretty big changes, which stands in contrast to the Stephen Harper approach, which was far more moderate and incremental. Now, I mentioned this in an interview with Power and Politics on CBC, and I saw it's been turned into a Liberal attack ad now of Pierre Poilievre is going to be Mike Harris. So the Liberals see me as this credible oracle now. But I do think there is something to that. I think that we see some pretty significant structural issues in the Canadian government right now that need big, quick action. And I think there's going to be a very eventful and forceful first 100 days, which was always that barometer for a government's tone and approach. And I think there has to be. I think if he gets elected on a...
Look, if he takes over, he'll be taking over a very different Canada and government than Stephen Harper took over for Paul Martin. Stephen Harper took over a functional bureaucracy and government problem, sure.
Yeah,
but
he took it over with a minority. So he was very limited in what he could do.
And you could also, you just didn't need a a massive change. You could do things incrementally. This is almost a poison chalice if Pierre Poilievre wins and becomes prime minister. He's taking over a really screwed up Canada.
Yeah, and again, for the guy that says governments need to balance the budget, how does he look at the deficits we're posting right now and come up with a plan to balance the budget that wouldn't require massive, massive cuts or some form of increased revenue, which is going to be a tax? So that's a big issue. And again, if I would look at this and say, you better find a way to balance the budget within 4 years to prove that you are delivering that fiscal vision you've been talking about. But I realize it's easier said than done when you're dealing with a government that's been as spend happy as the Liberals. But I think philosophically, the approach that I've been told is that he doesn't want to squander a majority. He wants to go in, and if he has the power to do things, wants to actually do them.
Well, it's by the time Stephen Harper took over with the majority in 2011, he'd been in office for 5 years and didn't have that energy, that desire for a great deal of change. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if and when it gets there. Andrew, thanks so much for the time. I know you've got a pile of other interviews to do. You got your day job to do. You got to get back home. So thanks for taking the time with us.
Always a pleasure, Brian. Thanks so much.
The book is called Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life. Read it. Get it. If I learn things, you will. Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue with theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Remember, you can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast. Leave us a rating, give us a review, tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.